Um, okay, so thanks to everyone for being here. We just want to say a few words about this conference and why we put it together. So it's been a decade now since Warren's Althusser and His Contemporaries was published, and the three of us, Dylan, Lale, and myself, thought it would be worthwhile to revisit this book, especially given that there's been a lot of really great scholarship on Althusser since the book was published, and many, but not all of the authors of those works are here. And I think if there's any testament to the power of Warren's book, it would certainly be the fact that everyone we initially asked to be part of this conference immediately agreed. We felt that many of the ongoing important questions and considerations with regards to reading Althusser are set out in Althusser and His Contemporaries' Philosophy's Perpetual War. Althusser's relationship to structuralism, his concepts of interpolation and the subject, and his late work on aleatory materialism are the central themes or nodes that Montag discusses, and his intervention has certainly opened up many pathways for scholarship on Althusser. We also wanted to return to the themes of force, the balance of forces, the idea of perpetual war, philosophy's perpetual war that we find throughout the book. Moreover, if many of the latter-day interventions have themselves often been directly impacted by the book, they've also been influenced by Warren's other works, including Bodies, Masses, Power, Spinoza and His Contemporaries, which will certainly come up today. And this is of all the more interest because Warren, of course, wrote the book Louis Althusser a decade before Althusser and His Contemporaries. That came out in 2002, already demonstrating the ongoing process or nature of this reading and rereading of Althusser. We therefore thought that there was an opportunity both to revisit the book on its own as well as to consider it in relation to other works. In our discussions, we also felt that it was of particular significance that this reading of Althusser and His Contemporaries has taken and takes place over a tremendous breadth of places. With this in mind, we can remember that one of the ways that Althusser explained the orienteering in his practice of reading capital was to go upstream in capital. Likewise, Warren's subtitle, Philosophy's Perpetual War, indicates a particular species of eternity that is not simply bound to space as an organic organism. We met in this place, our computers, as the Spinoza Studies Working Group of UC Berkeley. Over the past several years, we have read Spinoza's works and other works, including those of some of the speakers here today. Many of you have joined our meetings, and if you would like to join in the future, email us. And so each panel today, we have 4 panels. Each one will run for 1.5 hours, after which there will be a short 15-minute break. Warren's response will take place immediately after the final panel. We will then have time for some general discussion, and we will also take questions from the viewers. In the interest of making the most of our time, we will post all the speaker bios in the chat as well as in this Google Doc, which I'll share right now. We'll also share the English version of Juan Del Mazo's talk, which he's going to present in Spanish. Finally, we'd just like to thank all the panelists. We'd like to thank Tatiana Anushian for designing the flyer, and of course, Warren for writing this book that has brought us all together in one way or another. So, okay. So I'm going to put the speaker bios in the chat. Okay, so the first panel will include Giorgos Fourtounis, Natalia Romé, David Galashvili, and Stefano Pippa. So Giorgos, you can begin whenever you're ready.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you all of you for inviting me. And before I start, let me confess how important it is for me to participate, and with such a great company, of course, in this celebration of the 10th birthday of Warren Modak's book, Essential Book, but also to express my gratitude to the book itself, the whole work of its author, and of course to Warren. as my ways of reading, thinking, and writing, and not only on Althusser, have been shaped largely through a continued conversation with his texts. I was happy some 20 years ago to start to discuss with Warren himself. And today I have the strange feeling that after all those years, we continue the same interrupted discussion. And it is really moving. Okay, let me start now. Montague reminds us that Althusser conceptualizes the structure in contradistinction with the two notions of causality and the whole allowed by classical philosophy. First, what we could call the atomistic whole, governed by linear analytical causality. And second, the holistic whole, governed by essentialist expressive causality. In contrast, Althusser resorts to the concepts of overdetermination and Spinozist immanence to define the structure as the immanent cause of its elements and their structural relations, and the relative and the relevant alternative type of whole as the structured whole. As Montague points out, Althusser's positing the immanent structure against the essentialist whole summarizes his anti-Hegelianism and, by the same token, his anti-economism, philosophically supported by the notion of the materialist reversal of the Hegelian totality. Now, the economy becomes an effect and not the cause of the structure. Warren remarks, though, that in Althusser's discourse, the structure is the site of a tension or antithesis between two antagonistic, even irreconcilable conceptions. First, that of a deep latent structure transcended to the empirical field its structures, a closed structure totalizing its elements. A dualist notion reemerges thus, which opposes surface to depth, interior to exterior, materiality to ideality, essence to its expression or phenomenon. According to Montague, this first concept of structure consists in a recovery of the expressive totality within the very argument aiming to refute it. The second is a notion of surface without depth, where Althusser posits the Spinozist immanence against dualism, transcendence, totalization, and closure. Here, the heterogeneity, individuality, and incommensurability of both the structure and its elements are preserved. Structure now is just what holds together an irreducibly complex individuality. The immanent structure, which stands for, I quote from Montague, the Spinozist conatus of every singular being, its actual essence, an essence entirely coincident with its actual state. But what is and where this structure is situated, and how does it hold together its essentially irrelevant elements? Starting from the last, those elements are not by nature articulable. So I suggest what articulates the non-articulable elements has to exert some violence or causality on them to transform them somehow without turning them to its expression or phenomenon. Furthermore, what maintains those elements together cannot belong to the series of the elements. It is not interior to the structure individual, but it cannot be exterior to it either, neither simply an external constraint, which would trivialize the concept of structure, nor radically or ontologically exterior, that is, transcendent. Precisely at this point, where the structure has to be conceived as a relation of incongruous element, none of which, I quote, would be reducible to any of the others, or to a term outside the system, and the spatial metaphor inside, outside becomes highly questionable, I suggest turning to Derrida's deconstructive treatment of classical structuralism, to which Warren dedicates some very important pages in the book. And at the same time, to revisit another focal point of tensions in Althusser's structuralism, the insistent clause of the determination in the last instance of the social structure by its economical element, which seemingly restores economy as the structural cause, be it in the last instance. Criticism would see here the retraction of the very logic of overdetermination, the regression to the logic of the reversal, and the recovery of economist essentialism along with a metaphysical materialism. As it is known, Derrida criticizes the classical structuralism's notion of closed and centered structure, whereas a central and ontological privileged element both organizes and closes the structure, paradoxically oscillating between its interior and exterior. It is an element of the structure that cannot be included in the structure and undergo its causality. It functions as a transcendental signified, which in the limit, in the last instance, we could say, transcends the signifying structure, founding it to an extra structural point of presence. In the light of this, a determinant in the last instance economy could be seen as the placeholder of the transcendental signification. Derrida's critique of structuralism is taken to inaugurate the event of post-structuralism, not rejecting the traditional notion of structure, but announcing the inherently precarious possibility of a new concept, that of an open and descended structure. And Modag says precisely the same on Masseret's critique of Althusser's early structuralism. In general, Derrida dismissed as ineffective any attempt frontal attack to metaphysics by way of simple abolition, reduction, or reversal of the metaphysical concepts and dualisms. In contrast, the strategy of deconstruction involved a peculiar preservation of the relevant dualities without transcending them dialectically or otherwise, and without being subsumed to their binary logic. Thus, deconstruction necessarily involved two phases structurally linked. First, the reversal of a hierarchical dualism, an indispensable, inherently political, subversive moment, which nevertheless by itself is self-defeating. To remain in this phase, I quote from Derrida, is still to operate on the terrain of and from within the deconstructed system. So a second move is needed, marking the always precarious emergence of a new concept that can neither remain and function within the previous regime, nor exit that regime and transcend the reversed first concept. Instead, it reinscribes itself in the deconstructible field, dysfunctioning there, and defying its dilemmatic logic. That new awkward concept must coexist with the reversed old one in a non-reducible, untranscendable, and irreconcilable tension that the given field cannot accommodate. Now I claim that the many linguistic dualisms which Derrida discussed, such as signified, sensible, intelligible, speech, writing, etc., instantiate what I call the dualism of transcendence, which always subsumes the material to the ideal in their uncountable variations, and thus can be taken as the matrix of idealism, Derrida. Therefore, his deconstructive stratagem can be thought of as a materialist project. I quote, what I have attempted can also be inscribed under the rubric of the critique of idealism. If so, the mere reversal or reduction of the transcendent dualism, though structurally and politically necessary, remains hegemonized by what precisely it strives to overthrow. The matter would then function as a transcendental signifier. The material, considered simply as the contrary of the idea, would represent a materiality above all subordinated to ideality, and a materialism that would declare the primacy of this materiality would be an idealist materialism, if I may. Therefore, Derrida's critique of idealism could not be simply the emancipation of the material from the ideal, but its emancipation from its dual opposition to the ideal, without nevertheless transcending the antagonism of materialism and idealism. The whole move would tend towards a new concept of matter, which can neither remain in nor overcome, I quote, the negative, atheistic, insufficient, but indispensable phase of reversal, which remains an unsurpassable instance of the materialist insistence in contact with what materialism has represented as a force of resistance in the history of philosophy. End of quotes. In the light of all this, we could say that, up to a point, Althusser's overdetermination converges with Derrida deconstruction to the extent that the latter also criticizes the reversal of the Hegelian totality as the perhaps necessary but self-defeating first phase of a materialist project, even though inseparable from the subversive materialist quality attributed to Marxism, it is nevertheless doomed to relapse to a version of closed totality or structure ruled by a central essential principle. But perhaps surprisingly, Derrida seems to forget this nuanced critique when he refers to the specific version of reversal that is a structure determined in the last instance by its economic element. He no longer regards it as a part of the whole deconstructive move, a necessary, albeit insufficient phase of it, but unilaterally as the target of deconstruction. As he declares, referring specifically to Althusser, the concept of last instance would be the general concept of the deconstructible itself. And he concludes that, I quote, everything interesting and fruitful in the logic of overdetermination becomes compromised, reduced, crushed by this discourse on the last instance. End of quote. It seems that we have now to understand those irreducible opposed meanings of structure in Althusser, as Modak puts it, as a simple and trivial contradiction, where we would have either to eliminate the one or the other, or to dialectically reconcile and transcend both. My question then will be, can we understand those two antagonistic conceptions of structure in another way? Can we interpret otherwise their stumble and unresolved coexistence? I propose here to read Althusser's structuralism, and in particular his argument on overdetermination, as a deconstructive double writing, of which the notion of a structure determined in the last instance by the economy represent its first structural, that is, inescapable phase. Second phase, incongruous with the first, the second writing of overdetermination that traverses Althusser's text is correlative with the precarious emergence of the other concept of structure that Modak discusses, what I propose to call radical overdetermination, the mutual determination of all the elements of the structure, without any one of them being ontologically privileged and thus determinant, not even in the last instance. This is precisely the conception of structure as Spinoza's immanent cause, where the structure cause is the structure itself, the structure's causa sui, and not some purportedly essential element of it. Thus, radical overdetermination can be thought of as an episode of the event of post-structuralism, alluded by Derrida, announcing the theoretical possibility of an open and decentered structure. In that respect, I suggest Althusser's endeavor tends toward a new concept of matter, a new materiality which encompasses that of material production. not one that transcends, in the last instance, the structural play, but one that cannot be understood independently of the inexhaustible political and ideological overdeterminations that it always already constitutively undergoes. It is not the matter of transcendent dualism, but a new matter which, due to Spinoza's immanence, always already carries in its very materiality the effectivity of the instances of the so-called superstructure, and in particular of ideology, as Warren shows superbly in the chapter in Althusser and Foucault. A concept of social materiality that allowed Althusser to say that the ideas of ideology have material existence, that ideology is immanent to the social practices, including, of course, that of the economy and production. But the question still remains unanswered. What to do with the last instance? Radical overdetermination, indeed, tends toward what Derrida suggested to, I quote, to apply the name matter to that which lies outside all classical oppositions, and which should no longer be able to assume any reassuring form, neither that of a referent, nor that of a presence in any of its modes, nor that of a fundamental or totalizing principle, nor even of a last instance. So Derrida says, this new concept of structure and matter cannot take the form of a last instance. The question, though, is if it can and should get rid of it. If indeed radical overdetermination represents a new concept of the descended structure, that then, according to Derrida himself, it cannot just expel the old concept of the centered structure. It is necessary to question the centered structure, but, Derrida says, even today the notion of a structure lacking any center represents the unthinkable itself. Accordingly, the new immanentist concept cannot leave behind what remains nevertheless, as Modak shows, a form of centered structure that brings to the determinant, albeit in the last instance, position, the material production, overturning the hierarchy. Overdetermination cannot just turn its back to the last instance. We are now perhaps in a better position to tackle the enigma of the insistence of the last instances phrase. I claim that its unremitting reappearance in Althusser's discourse denotes something that both he cannot get rid of and, at the same time, he cannot afford to surrender. It has not to do with an eternal antinomy of the logic of overdetermination, neither with the external addendum of a Marxist provision that would distort its logic. It has to do with the double writing of overdetermination, the necessary coexistence of two irreconcilable meanings of structure, two incompatible texts of overdetermination. It is precisely the mutual dependence and incompatibility of the two that brings Althusser's undertaking close to the strategy of deconstruction, as if applying in advance Derrida's lesson. I quote, these two operations must be conducted in a kind of disconcerting simul, in a movement that must be coherent, of course, but at the same time divided, differentiated, and stratified. The gap between the two operations must remain open. This is clearly a sufficient indication of the necessary heterogeneity of each text participating in this operation, and of the impossibility of summing up the gap at a single point or under a single name, end of quote. And perhaps now we can elaborate a little better the aporia of the crucial and controversial phrase at the core of the discourse of overdetermination, which posits economy as determinant in a last instance that never comes. It is a last instance structurally deferred, as it were. To close now, the antinomy between the metaphysical fastening of the structure to a non-structural materiality on the one hand, and the unlimited structurality of the radical overdetermination on the other, acquires thus a positive meaning. It claims both of its terms, or better, it claims the claiming of both against the system that forbids it, against the thought of metaphysics and transcendence. In other words, as I suggest, Althusser subsumed his text and his whole problematic to that antinomy, not only in order to be able to inscribe his iconoclastic intervention to what could still then be called Marxism, not only to inscribe his venture to historical communism, but also to inscribe his endeavor to a non-metaphysical materialism, a materialism that wouldn't be made to be submissive to idealism, an endeavor that he pursued until his last writings. In short, Althusser takes the risks of that quasi-antinomy to inscribe himself to the multifarious collective striving of his great philosophical generation, the necessary as well as impossible task of questioning the metaphysics of presence and transcendence from the only available terrain of precisely that metaphysics. And I think this was the way I could comply with Warren's incitement, with which it introduces us to his great book, that, quote, we must understand Althusser's work as constituted by contradiction and antagonism, and that it becomes intelligible on this basis alone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Giorgos. That was excellent. Okay, next, Natalia.
Okay. I'm very happy to share this moment with you, and especially for this invitation to celebrate the anniversary of Althusser and his contemporaries. Althusser says that a theoretical body is incomplete, but reading Warren, we can also say that readings, on the other hand, although partial or partisan, are infinite. Althusser and his contemporaries is a book full of demarcations. It is a book that moves forward, tracing internal borders to Althusserian writing and borders concerning the way in which it has been understood or discussed. And yet, it is also a book that opens in innumerable directions and profundities, a book in which contemporaneity explodes into heterogeneous genealogies and resonance, and we will not stop reading it, and those who will follow us will not stop reading it. But there is something else. This book gave us a firm point around which we have built a community. Warren's work opened a wide and generous path that shelters and supports us in a task of theoretical creation, of reading, but also, and we know it, of combat within unequal relations. And I say it as a South American. I want to say it publicly, the generosity, but especially the sincere respect, non-paternalistic nor exoticist that Warren has shown in his dialogues with me and with my colleagues of Latin America Network of Althusserian Studies is very unusual. Well, my talk will concentrate on one of those paths that Warren's work in his reading of Althusser has inspired. I would like to share some meditations on chapters 7 and 8 of Althusser and his contemporaries, but which also take up Warren's other writings on what we can call a materialism of the imaginary. I am not going to unfold the whole question, which is very broad. I am going to concentrate on an aspect that I believe is less explored and that can be read in the framework that unites and separates Althusser and Foucault around the problem of the materiality of interpellation. It is not only about Althusser and Foucault, of course. It is about the way in which many readings that wanted to be critical regarding this question lost on the way its constitutive critical force. On this question, in chapter 8, Montag argues around the radical exteriority of ideology in Althusser, and two movements take place in his treatment that, as I understand it, open up to the play of attention. The first one is oriented to unfold a positive theory of interpellation as radical exteriority, especially in its power to disarticulate the topic of interiority, in which the images of the causa sui subject and the formulas of intersubjectivity converge. There, it is possible to follow the gravitation of the ideas of Pascal and Spinoza until arriving through Althusser to Foucault. In the first movement, Foucault is the great reader of Althusser. Montag proposes that, I quote, Foucault opens an entire dimension that Althusser's essay unwittingly presupposes, a history of the body, the history of the individual itself. He allows us to see the regime of individualization, or at least the descending individualization that particularizes and identifies those on whom power is exercised as strategy. End of the quote, of the quotation. I think this point is interesting to return to the chapters of Sur la reproduction, in which Althusser locates the question of individuation within production in terms of the category of trigger, the individual as a support of relations of production, from which standpoint the subject is abstract and has no singularity. This is how Althusser translates the expression that Marx pours out in the second chapter of Capital, when he speaks of the owner as the personification of the relations of production. Althusser will show in chapter 5 of Sur la reproduction, regarding law, that when we speak of the owner as a person, we are already in the sphere of the individual as subject, that is to say, in the sphere of reproduction. It is not by chance that this chapter is the chapter that undistinguishes what Althusser seems to separate in his famous article, Ideology and Ideological States Apparatuses, ideology and force, in law, in its institutions and practices, and in the juridical ideology that sustains it as a moral supplement, ideological apparatuses and the repressive apparatus of the state erase their boundaries. But let us return to chapter 8 of Warren's book. After having shown what Foucault reads in Althusser, beyond Althusser, Montag poses the opposite movement. Althusser returns as a reader of Foucault through the Foucauldianism of Judith Butler. Reading Psychic Life of Power, Montag focuses on an element that has also been underlined by Etienne Balibar concerning the problem not of the individual, but of the subject. And I may say that this is a capital difference. Judith Butler has pointed, as Warren poses, to the centrality of what Althusser himself called a theoretical scene in our little theoretical theater. The allegorical figure in which a subject is hailed, the subject turns around and then accepts the terms by which he or she is hailed. As a result of a movement of readings, reading upon reading, Montag lets us see what Foucault shows without being able to see it himself. Montag wonders, what is the nature of this instrument that allows the body to be better administered and controlled, and how exactly does it exercise mastery of the body? To answer these questions, Foucault, like Althusser, is compelled to turn to allegory to represent the irrepresentable and to think the unthought. I refer, of course, says Montag, to the panopticon, understood not as an actually existing existing piece of punitive or merely disciplinary architecture, and therefore part of the means of spatial domination, but rather as an architectural figure. End of the quotation. Montag shows that the panopticon as a metaphor reveals in the individualized body something that is not identical to the individual. That something is the subject as the point of unrepresentability, which can be located not as the pure product of interpolation understood as the factory of subjectivity, but as a décalage of subjection and subjectivation. That décalage that Balibar has located in the French word assujettissement as the play of an internal dislocation or ambivalence, or to put it in the Lacanian jargon of Paul-Henri, Michel Pecheu's disciple, the play of equivocity inscribed in the very materiality of the letter. This ambivalence that Lacan will try to capture with the category of la langue is an indication, a trace of the point of irreducibility of the subject, not only to the individuated body, but also to the subjectivity as a performative effect of discipline inscribed in discourse. It is the paradoxical point of singularity that we can only locate as an immanent surplus that refutes the very idea of history as a social fabric of subjectivities. It is at this point that Montag takes a further step that I believe inaugurates a research program both rich for revisiting the blanks in Althusser's writings and potent for showing its vitality in our current theoretical conjuncture. That step is the one that connects the irreducible dislocation of the subject with a materialism of the imaginary. The imaginary is here registered by Montag as the force of the gave in the metaphor of the panopticon. I quote him. Montag says, this is what Foucault, in fact, will call the major effect of the panopticon, to induce in the inmate, le détenu, a conscious and permanent state of visibility that assures the automatic functioning of power. What exactly is a conscious state of visibility? The visible individual becomes conscious of being visible, being watched, and he watched himself under surveillance, exercising self-surveillance. This is very different from the action of conscience, in which an individual subjects himself to moral judgment. What Foucault has described is nothing less than the genesis of consciousness, even if this genesis, as in the case of interpellation, cannot be understood in terms of a before and after or of a sequence. The awareness of our visibility becomes the perception of what passes in a man's own mind, Locke's definition of consciousness. Well, this is the end of the quotation. This is where all the fruitfulness of Montag's operations opens up. Materialism of the imaginary is here not only the theory of the material effects of the imagination, not only refers to the material connections of images and bodies in the category of Umwelt, although is related to it in what it has of interior exteriority, or to put it with a Lacanian concept of extimacy, a space of interiority that unfolds as the subject's environment. But beyond those meanings, the imaginary materiality is also the material trace in theoretical writing that indicates or alludes to the ungraspable point of its connection with the real of history, or as Lire le Capital poses, the exact measure of a distance, of an interior displacement, or décalage, of the real inscribed in its structure, the inaudible and illegible notation of a structure of structures. That point is only accessible from its effects in writing as a displacement between allegories, figurations, or metaphors within the limit of discourse regarding its possibility of capturing the unrepresentable of the real. The force of the imaginary and the fictional opens up as spectral materiality, immanent to the signifying materiality, but irreducible to the order of representation. I will try to mention some elements that I find most interesting within these ideas. The first one is that Montag let us read in the metaphor of the panopticon the operation of what Lacan calls mirror stage as formator of the ego, that establishes the ego as fundamentally dependent upon external objects. Lacan allows us to locate the specificity of the register of the imaginary as a scenic space, as a staging of visibility that structures the vision of the subject on the basis of the desire of the begather, as a precipitated solution to its own inadequacy. The attention that Montag directs to the force of optical allegories in Foucault allows us to read in another way a different metaphor that Montag himself does not fail to emphasize, not only in Althusser, but also in what is revealed in Michel Pecheu's reading of Althusser, the theatrical metaphor of consciousness as a stage. Visibility and scene are the traces that allow us to find in the materialism of the imaginary a theory of the phantasm. I keep here the category of phantasm instead of using the expression with which it is usually found in English as fantasy, in order to underline the spectral force that it brings with it and that is irreducible to the semantics of misrecognition, distortion, unknowing, or illusion, in which it is sometimes subsumed. The phantasm is the positive effect of a torsion, a temporal gap in the transindividual topic that Lacan identifies as sexual non-relation, to locate the point of the collage in the overdetermination of relational plexus in which identification as ideological subject takes shape. Radically exterior, the phantasm is nevertheless the frame or the fictional window through which the subject experiences itself as interiority and from which it gazes the world of her experiences as the surrounding exterior world. At this point, the radical exteriority of the imaginary acquires a liminal condition because it is that which lends its phantasmatic materiality to an operation of spatialization. This is the demarcation between the interior and the exterior spaces, the objective and the subjective. For psychoanalysis, and especially for Lacan, the phantasm represents the double relation of desire with the imaginary dimension as the narcissistic support of desire, and the symbolic dimension as the stage that will house this game. This is the point at which Lacan abandons the dialectic of recognition and opens the question of the specificity of psychic causality that will lead him to reformulate within the phantasm and desire the Freudian category of drive in the register of the real. Between chapters 7 and 8 of Althusser and his contemporaries, this question is skirted innumerable times in the references to Freudian formulations of the primordial phantasm, in reference to the retroactive temporality of Nachtraglichkeit, in the identification of the singular force of the gaze and vision as an order of immanent materiality, but irreducible to the signifying materiality of discourse. And finally, it is also located as if in passing, in Warren's text, beyond the gaze towards an openness to the multiplicity of regimes of materiality that are encrypted in his texts as, I quote, the indelible traces of language itself, the utterance, the word, the signifier. End of the quotation. Well, the second issue I want to underline, I would like to underline of this operation produced by Montag's text, has to do with his reading of Spinoza. The imaginary is at the beginning of chapter 8, also located as a reminder of an effect that renders itself present as absence in the disjunction between readings, reading of readings that allow the words to crash into each other, making their constitutive metaphorical force resound. This is what Montag says when he states without hesitation that Althusser retains idealist language riddled with images of interiority, just as Spinoza retains God. What Montag is pointing out to us there is the practical and material force of the symptomatic reading as an expository formula of decalage in the immanence of discourse. And not coincidentally, Freud is then evoked. Warren says, perhaps Althusser deliberately refrained from directly using the Spinozist language that caused such controversy when it appeared at the end of Reading Capital. But the concept is there. Ideology is immanent in its apparatuses and the practices. It has no existence apart from these apparatuses and is entirely coincident with them. Ideas have thus disappeared into their material manifestations, becoming like causes that exist only in their effects, or to add a Freudian reference that is entirely in keeping with both Spinoza and Althusser, ideas in this sense are causes that are ever only constituted nachträglich, retroactively, as the effect of the material effects. The first point to note here is the bridge that Montag reconstructs between the Althusser of Lire le Capital and the Althusser of Sur la Reproduction. Symptomatic theory is at the heart, or symptomatical reading theory is at the heart of the theory of ideology, whose theoretical premises are impossible to deploy without first formulating the question of the limits of writing and reading, without giving oneself a theory of reading as reading in the opacity of the immediate that Althusser finds both in Spinoza and Freud. Only then is it possible to approach the radical force of immanence as a critique of the phantasmatic scene that returns incessantly as a topic of interiority. This is the blind spot, for example, of the Foucauldian category of episteme, whose non-contradictory uniqueness coincides with the absence of a question about the epistemic conditions of enunciation, the category of episteme. In this way, we come to understand the critical force that emerges from an operation in which the Althusser of Lire le Capital reads Foucault reading the Althusser of ideology and ideological state apparatuses in order to point out that blind spot of Foucault. This critical operation brings about a new allegory, an allegory that Montag works beautifully in another text that I had the good fortune to translate for the colloquium we held in Buenos Aires for the 5th anniversary of Lire le Capital. And that since then I have not stopped reflecting on. It is about the allegory of authorless theater, an allegory to which we once again have access as a result of reading of readings, in which Montag reads Balibar, reading Althusser, reading Brecht. Warren says, Althusser once made what he called the simple observation that in a conflictual situation one cannot see everything from everywhere. Although the situation in question was class society and therefore class struggle, Althusser's work as a whole allows or perhaps compels us to understand even theoretical texts as conflictual situations, that is, as sites of active antagonism, visible only from certain positions in the topography of theory and intelligible only to those who occupy these positions. The very idea of the field of the visible may be understood as a philosophical dramatization, a space where something is exhibited or placed in order to be seen. Indeed, reading Balibar's essay, we cannot help but ask ourselves how, with few exceptions, we fail to see the theatricality of Althusser's practice of theory. End of the quotation. I will conclude my intervention by affirming that this figure of the authorless theater leads us to the track of the epistemological relevance of the materialism of the imaginary that allows us to recognize the theoretical and philosophical function of the phantasm, no longer as a content of the Althusserian theory of the subject, but as a dimension of his materialist problematization of philosophy. The phantasm haunts the materiality of theoretical discourse with the same force that the spectrum of politics besieges the present. This opens a new political fold of the so-called Althusserian theoreticism, the phantasmatic dimension of knowledge that psychoanalysis tends to locate as the heart of clinical practice, and that allows us to capture another resonance of what Althusser left open in his unpublished text of 1985, the condition of Marxism and psychoanalysis as clinical theories. The intervention, the clinical practice of psychoanalysis is oriented by a desire to know, not so much to have a knowledge, but to know how to operate conveniently. That is to say, to know how to read in another way the gradient of words, as Lacan says in his seminar number 25. In order to grasp the experience of the non-existence of a sexual relation as a knowledge that is trapped in the words of the subject, a knowledge not known in the inclinations and deviations which allow us to read in another way the economy of jouissance that the word entails. Althusser evokes this knowledge proper to clinical practice in order to indicate a profound epistemological position, that science is the science of experience, which implies that the criterion of the true is immanent to the theoretical practices under historical conditions of possibility. I believe that we can find there the trace of the spectral force of politics in the singular poetic materiality of the latter. Politics as a spectrum that incessantly haunts the writing of Lire le Capital. I close then, as Warren closes his lecture, a closure that is inevitably a poetic openness. So I invite you to listen, Warren, when he says, the search to complete the incomplete meaning opens on the unfinishable work of substitution. Behind the masks are only other masks. Behind the machinery, only machines that produce the machines. Behind Althusser's words, other words, so many traces of a meaning that has never been and never will be present. Althusser foraging for terms in the space of an absence and surrounded by silence, stumbled upon the fissure that history has opened and through it saw himself, an actor on the stage of the authorless theater, transcribing the words of its silent discourse and reading them aloud, a maker and a destroyer of machines, the dramaturg of an unknown world. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. That was really great. Next, we have David.
Hi everyone. First of all, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very pleased and grateful to be here because Warren's works served as a guide for my thesis for a long time, and the book on Althusser has helped me to define and decipher a number of concepts. So I'm pleased to present a report on Spinoza and several of his contemporaries according to those texts. So today I would like to discuss materiality of ideology in Spinoza and some of his contemporaries and predecessors. First, I will review some points in the Althusserian conception of ideology in a general and schematic way, and consequently demonstrates this concept with concrete examples. Also, here I would like to mention and focus on several texts by Warren. I mean, Bodies, Masses, and Power, and the article, The Commanding the Body, in which, using the Althusserian approach, he clearly showed the material existence of ideology in Spinoza and his contemporaries, and in general, the materiality of the text and its material effects. So I'll start by setting out ideas which are some of the theoretical premises of my report. And two central theses. The first, ideology has a material existence, which means ideology is embedded in individuals' everyday lives. In other words, it determines their bodily dispositions. And by bodily dispositions, we also mean the attitudes and behaviors of individuals, that is, their consciousness, as Althusser puts it. Such a statement is maybe unfamiliar to the dominant or liberal idealist tradition of philosophy, but as Montag notes, Althusser takes an essentially Spinozist step when he rejects the dualism of body and mind, which ultimately means a rejection of subjectivity. So, quote from the text. Consciousness disappears into acts and mind into the body, but the next quote, it's not only to make ideology an affair of bodies rather than minds, but it is to materialize it altogether. The second point is that the category of subject is a constitutive of all ideology. And Alex Kallinikos, in one of his texts, notes that the category of subject is therefore uniquely fitted to the purpose of ideology, by placing the individual in a structure which enables him to recognize himself in the world, to see it as a world in a sense created for him, in which there is a place for him. And assurance is offered that if he conforms with what is required of him by society, all will be well for him. And we can see the direct link here with an ethics of Spinoza. I mean the appendix of first chapter. Those who deny the materiality of ideology see it only as an illusion of consciousness, which can disappear through a certain anti-ideology or anti-prejudice. To declare that ideology is merely an illusion of consciousness is in itself a belief in dualism, an affirmation of the separation of body and mind or consciousness. Consequently, ideology is also based on the dualism of body and mind as a constitutive and basic principle. For the idealist tradition of philosophy, body and mind are two opposing realms, one of which necessarily dominates the other. This tradition is obvious in the philosophy of Descartes, in which the confrontation of body and soul is clear. According to its doctrines, the body is a source of sin and animal instincts, while the soul belongs to a realm above and beyond nature. Hence, the widespread belief that corporeal substance does not pertain to God's essence, and most writers seek to prove that corporeal substance is unworthy of the divine essence and cannot pertain to it. Cartesian view of the world is based on the assumption that while body acts, spirit suffers, and vice versa. He argues in the Passions of Soul that we should recognize that passions in the soul are usually actions in the body. In his Meditations, Descartes describes the body as a mechanical, godless machine that can perform its typical functions without the interference of a will or mind. End quote. I might consider the body of a man as a kind of machine, even if there were a mind in it. It would still perform all the same movements as it now does in those cases where movement is not under the control of the will or of mind. But Descartes does not stop here, but must take an additional step and argue the mind can function independently of the body, and indicates in the Meditations that, quote, I'm really distinct from my body and can exist without it. Thus Descartes directly claims that man is non-extended, simply a thinking thing who can think himself without body and perceptions. This bifurcation of the human being, the hostile attitude of soul and body towards each other, creates a danger that the human being will be reduced to an inanimate mechanical automaton. Quote, the human body belongs to this world, and insofar as it communicates its mechanicity to the mind, constantly threatens to reduce man to a machine. This quote is from Montag's article, Commanding the Body. And the only way to get rid of the animal realm is to have a will that is capable of overcoming this material mechanical state of human animal. And as Warren says, that power is the will itself. It is this alone that allows us to raise ourselves above the corporeal world of automatons. Thus, for Descartes, the body is not only the external but also the internal enemy of the soul, which pushes the soul to do what it does not want. The separation of body and soul is accompanied by the separation of the order and regularity of these two dimensions. If the body and at the same time the soul is capable of acting independently of each other, they are also subject to a different order of action. The authentic victory of the soul is a death and annihilation of the corporeal body, which the body naturally resists in seeking self-preservation. In addition to the theoretical content, Descartes' standpoint also had a political implication. For instance, the soul or mind may aspire to the glorification of the sovereign and individuals. And the quote from Spinoza, from Theological Political Treatise. And of the sovereign and individuals will not think it humiliating but supremely glorious to spill their blood and sacrifice their lives for the glorification of a single man. But the body resists death and seeks self-preservation. So, as Montag puts it, for Spinoza, the separation of soul and body is not simply an illusion of consciousness, even though this notion contains in itself an imaginary view of the order and laws of nature. The theoretical construction of the separation of body and soul or mind has a certain material existence, basis, and effect, which affects the corporeal world through various institutions, laws, and cultural codes. And quote from Warren, the imaginary is inscribed in the corporeal realities of subjection, legal and otherwise, and the apparatuses in which they are realized. Thus, according to Montag, also attributing to the soul the ability to control the body is based on erroneous assumptions. It is by no means an illusion. Granting the individual free will makes him responsible for his actions, both causally and legally, and for which he is liable and in case of overstepping the law punishable. The quote from another book about Althusser, Transitions. The imaginary element of ideology that by which we each believe ourselves to be the cause of what we do is false, but nevertheless real and material. We are interpellated, addressed, judged, and punished as the authors of our actions, our bodies caught in a very real apparatus of subjection. Neither the legal definition of the individual as a subject nor the various means of coercion and punishment, this definition justifies are illusory. Even if they are false, they are real and material. The conatus, as a persistence of the body may conflict with the limits of the law, especially when respecting law and properties retains one's physical existence. For Descartes, inclinations that arises from the body to flee danger and seek safety can and must be overcome, and individuals must be trained to allow themselves to be killed in the service of the sovereign. This postulates explains a constitutional illusion, also liberal and idealist tradition, according to which legal, formal power determines and expresses actual power relations. And quote from Badiou's Masses and Power. An entire philosophical tradition has confused laws of nature, which describes what necessarily exists, with social laws, which prescribes how things ought to be, and physical power with legal power. Spinoza's contemporary, and in some sense predecessor, Thomas Hobbes rejects Descartes' ontological dualism. But as Etienne Balibar writes, his work offers a mere materialist inversion of theological schemes. For instance, when in the chapter 14 of Leviathan, Hobbes tells us that each man has natural inherited liberty, which enables them to use their power according to their will and decision. Hobbes assumes a distinction between an internal world of freedom, determined by the will alone, and an external world via the true impediments to the realization of an individual's exist. And quote from the Leviathan itself. The right of nature, which writers commonly call jus naturale, is a liberty each man has to use his own power as he will himself for the preservation of his own nature, that is to say, of his own life, and consequently of doing anything which in his own judgment and reason he shall conceive to be the aptest means thereunto. By liberty is understood, according to the proper signification of the word, the absence of external impediments, which impediments may oft take away part of a man's power to do what he would, but cannot hinder him from using the power left him, according as his judgment and reason shall dictate to him. Furthermore, Hobbes' dualism is also situated in the political field. For example, he draws a strict distinction between the so-called legal subject and the irrational and disobedient individual who is a legal subject's own other, and represents a constant threat to the legal subject. Another representative of liberal tradition, John Locke, continues Hobbes' line of thought and attributes perfect freedom to the inner world of the individual. And quote from Locke of the state of nature. All men are naturally in, and that is a state of perfect freedom to order their actions, and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, within the bounds of the law of nature, without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other man. The second part of the sentence requires our attention insofar as Locke ignores the effects of a bodily interaction here. He finds the order and regularity of an individual's action as the outcome of free will that is independent of any other man. In Locke's fragment, even the law of nature, intelligible through human reason, requires an act of will, that is, a will to consult reason, which is at law. Also, we can find here the political implication because the separation of body and mind and body is necessary to endow individuals with the freedom that allows them to be declared responsible for their actions. What is most notable is that not only via dualism is declared and principle of subjectivity is carried through its logical sequence, but in Spinoza himself, we find a number of moments that unintentionally draw on the very concept he explicitly rejects. In Body's Masses Power, Montag restates that thesis that there is no possibility to be out of ideology at all, and he invokes Spinoza's phrase that all men are liable to superstition, also Spinoza himself. Montag sees the restoration of dualism in the theological political treatise, also until then, in 16th chapter, Spinoza had oppose the same dualism in the form of the division of language and nature, language and reality. Spinoza shows that materiality of the text on the example of the scripture. But paradoxically, the corporealization of scripture follows, as Montag calls it, a fantasy of juridical transcendence. Quote, he thus denies the materiality of the Calvinist agitator's words, the ability to stir up the indignation of the multitude and move their bodies to savage acts. Regardless of the moments, for example, we find such a moment when Spinoza discusses democracy in a political treatise. In Spinoza, we already find what Althusser calls matrix of ideology. This is because Spinoza is aware of the ideological essence of dualism, the dualism that determines the activity, attitudes, and behavior of institutions, individuals, and societies in general. In Spinoza's writings, it is already clear that the liberation of consciousness from ideology is an illusion and an ideological concept in itself, because the central purpose of ideology is the body and material existence. So, thought cannot be free while the body is constrained and unable to break out of the ritualized movements of daily life. Organization and disciplinary ordering of bodies tend to produce obedience or ways of thinking that affirm obedience. Only when the corporeal regimes break down through internal conflict or external events does thinking change. In the fifth chapter of the Theological Political treatise, Spinoza uses the example of the Hebrew state and to show the ways the sovereign can achieve a disciplined and obedient society. According to him, certain rites and ceremonies serve precisely to produce a subjected body and mind and prevent revolt. Quote from Spinoza. They were not permitted to plow or sow or reap as they pleased, nor could they eat or dress or shave their heads or beards as they pleased, but all in accordance with a fixed and specific ordinance of the law. That is a commandment to act or not to act in specific ways in the smallest activities of everyday life and existence. The error of the liberal tradition, from Spinoza's point of view, is that society derives from the free will of the individual, from a free mental decision that allows them through a contract to transcend the material world. The constitutional illusion or legalism adopted by the liberal tradition rests on a dualism between body and mind and fact and right. Contrary to this, in the third part of the Ethics, Spinoza clearly shows that there is no way out from the material world, from the bodily realm. Quote from Ethics. Mental decisions are nothing more than the appetites themselves, varying therefore according to the varying disposition of the body. Spinoza's conceptual revolution has become the reason why Althusser claimed to discover the matrix of every possible theory of ideology in his works. And quote from Althusser, I saw in it immediately the matrix of every possible theory of ideology and benefited from it. By refusing to treat ideology as a simple ignorance or superstition, he chose to examine this world of the imaginary in relation to the materiality of bodies, which he viewed as aspects of thought and extension respectively. In so doing, Spinoza avoided every illusion of an originary constitutive subject and so helped furnish Althusser's own quest to develop a theory of ideology in his respect. Spinoza is a kind of immanent cause for Althusserian claim that ideology has a material existence. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And now our last presenter will be Stefano.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for the invitation and for the opportunity to participate in such a rich event on the 10th anniversary of Althusser and his contemporaries, and also for arranging things in such a way that has to combine different time zones. I would like to begin with personal memory of my encounter with the book in 2013. At the time of its publication, I had just started working on a thesis on Althusser, and I still remember the sense of excitement when faced with a new book which dealt with the same subject as my PhD and promised to become, as was immediately clear on reading it, an inescapable reference for Althusser studies. By leaving behind the interpretative frameworks that had dominated the first reception of Althusserian thought, Montag's book gave a great boost to the second reception in two ways. On the one hand, it reopened old questions in an entirely new manner. On the other, and at the same time, it posed new questions, showing how Althusser, far from being a dead dog, as Eliot once wrote, could still have much to say in the present conjuncture. The strength of Montag's book seemed to me, and still seems to be this: its capacity to show how all the new materials which had progressively become available, or archival materials, could produce a new reading of Althusser, not only because unsuspected texts had come to light, and of course I'm thinking here of the books on Machiavelli or others, other texts such as The Underground Current, etc., but also because many of these materials, as Montag put in a phrase that was very important to me from a methodological point of view, and I quote, had the effect of changing what is also visible in Althusser's previous production, allowing for a new reading more attentive to the nuances present in his work, end quote. As I see it, two are the main theoretical points where Montag's reading contributed decisively to changing what was visible in the best-known Althusserian texts. On the one hand, his reading of Althusser's engagement with structuralism, and on the other, his reading of his theory of ideology, two cornerstones of Althusserianism on which Montag cast a new gaze that went far beyond sedimented interpretations. Since I cannot go into both aspects in depth here, I decided to focus on the second one, ideology. No doubt because for me, his pages on ideology have been the ones with which the dialogue was and is most intense. I would therefore like to take this opportunity to attempt to do, albeit briefly, two things: to reconstruct what seems to me to be the strong points of Montag's interpretation, and to raise some questions that his reading contained in the central chapters of the book, 6, 7, and 8, but especially I will focus on the last one, have posed and continue to pose to me. The innovation brought by Montag consists first and foremost, it seems to me, in the contestation of an interpretative cliché implicit in much of the previous literature. That is, the idea that Althusser's theory of ideology, with regard not to its opposition to science but to the social role of ideology, presents a continuity running from the thesis presented in Marxism and Humanism that ideology represents the imaginary relationship that men entertain with their conditions of existence, and the thesis of the interpellation of the individual as subject put forth in 1970 in the famous essay. In contrast to this idea, Montag builds his reinterpretation of Althusser's theory by insisting on internal transformations, on the gaps between texts, and even, as is the case with this analysis of the ISA essay, within texts. Simplifying to the extreme, because otherwise, of course, it would take us too long, let us say that Montag constructs his interpretation in three major steps. First, analyzing the 1964 essay contained in For Marx, Montag shows how the formulation on the imaginary nature of ideology mixes contradictory references from phenomenology to structuralism to Spinoza. Here, Montag suggests Althusser produces a representational conception of ideology still caught up in a problematic of consciousness. And in my view, Montag was the first to show all the gaps, the complexities in this essay. The second step in Montag's interpretation consists in showing that the genesis of the problematic of the constitution of subjectivity originates not in the confrontation with Lacan's notion of the imaginary, but in the lectures on psychoanalysis from 62-63, on the basis of the Spinozan concept of the imaginary as word, derived from an interpretation of Spinoza that opposes such concept to the Cartesian foundation of psychology and the articulation of the subject of imputation on the subject of truth. In this second step, then, Montag shows that this problem of the constitution of subjectivity finds its first substantial but ambiguous elaboration in the three notes on the theory of discourses, in which Althusser specifies the structure of a double specularly centering in which the mechanism of production of the subject consists, that is, interpellation. Via a careful reading, Montag argues that Althusser here remains caught in, I quote, in the contradiction between a notion of interiority as constituted from the outside and the notion of interiority that precedes and founds the outside, end quote. The third step of Montag's interpretation, which is, I think, the most important, is the one that directly confronts the essay, in which Althusser carries through to the end his rupture with any residual theorization of ideology based on interiority, and, according to Montag, proposes a version of ideology that is radically irreducible to any previous theorization, including his own, namely the thesis whereby ideology has a material existence in apparatuses. Here, Montag's interpretative move could, I think, be summarized as follows. Under the prism of the thesis of the materiality of ideology, which under Spinoza's aegis definitively banishes any notion of independent interiority, the very notion of interpellation, which Althusser seems to merely import from the three notes, splits into two and must therefore be reinterpreted beyond the letter of Althusser's text. On the one hand, there is the idea, in continuity with the three notes, that interpellation can be, as it has been read, as a drama of recognition, which presupposes an interiority. On the other hand, it is possible, and actually necessary, argues Montag, to extract from Althusser's pages a fully materialist version, constructed, I quote, according to the premises of ideology has a material existence, quote, for which interiority is the backlash of exteriority. The individual, writes Montag, is endowed with a factitious, if not fictitious or imaginary interiority after the fact of bodily action, a paradoxical interior that, having no place in us, is constructed around us, outside of us, end quote. Here, it should be noted that Montag's discourse leans towards Foucault's theorization, which is not only read in continuity with the materialist side of the interpellation, but which itself seems to function as a prism that has allowed the Althusserian text to be retroactively illuminated, allowing its contradiction and unevennesses to emerge precisely because it developed, I quote, certain of its theses, notably those concerned with the materiality of ideology, in order to show their stark incompatibility with other elements of Althusser's discussion of ideology, end quote. Based on this, Montag shows how Foucault was able to fully develop in a freer way, because he was not bound to a Marxist vocabulary, Althusser's Spinozist intuitions, arguing in a passage that I regard as crucial that, I quote, Althusser's central thesis, ideology interpellates individuals as subjects, only takes its full meaning in relation to what we might call Foucault's reading of the materiality of ideology, a notion rewritten as the physical order of disciplines, end quote. At this point in Montag's argument, interpellation is split into two, in its two tendencies, so to speak, idealist and materialist, which coexist in an unstable manner and never seem to find, as Montag shows well, a point of stabilization within Althusser's essay. But it is clearly only the materialist version, conceptually reconstructed through analysis, that for Montag does justice to the essay's innovation. As I see it, the rereading of this thesis by Montag, which I have summarized briefly but hopefully not unfaithfully, achieves a twofold result, which consists of addressing two thorny problems within the reception of Althusser's theory. A result, however, which opens up new questions, among which I will then select one, which I feel fits fully into the very framework of Montag's text. In fact, it seems to me that Montag's interpretation, circulating as it does between Spinoza and Foucault, read in effect in a certain continuity themselves, has a twofold global effect on the theory of interpellation, which we can call its historical anchoring, which in turn allows Althusser's thesis to be endowed with a greater consistency than it has in fact in its very formulation. If it is possible to speak of historical anchoring, it is because the thesis on the primacy of materiality, the materialist version of the notion of interpellation constructed by Montag, is in fact linked by Montag to very precise regimes of materiality that are also regimes of historicity, and this in a twofold sense. On the one hand, it points to the history of the body and to the regime of modern individualization investigated by Foucault, who, Montag writes, I quote, opens up an entire dimension that Althusser's essay unwittingly presupposes, end quote, precisely because it describes, I quote again, the material conditions of the possibility of interpellation, end quote, in the analysis of disciplinary regimes as strategies of segmentation and serialization aimed at containing the effects of capitalist organization. Resuming, but in a very different way, an attempt that already Poulantzas had undertaken at the end of the 70s. The reading that Montag offers of Foucault's essay allows us, if not to resolve, at least to confront in a coherent manner, a real problem that every reader of Althusser's essay must always face, namely the thorny status of the concept of individual. In the formula, ideology interpolates individuals as subjects. A question, as is well known, never directly addressed by Althusser. By linking the notion of interpellation to the history of the techniques of production of individuality, this path produces evidently a very precise consequence, namely the anchoring of Althusser's thesis on interpellation to a regime of production of individuality, to strategies and practices of individualization, precisely the disciplines. The second sense in which Montag's reading refers to regimes of historicity is linked to the second part of Althusser's thesis, concerning not the individual, but the subject. Here too, interpretations of Althusser's theory have often stumbled, oscillating between different interpretations, which we can distribute on two sides. On the one hand, we would have the subject understood as a concept or a category that is transhistorical, thus pertaining to the level of generality that Althusser attributes to its thesis on ideology in general. And on the other hand, the subject understood as the central concept of bourgeois modernity, and thus as an ideological notion itself. As has been noted, for instance, by Pascal Gillot, these different interpretations are materially inscribed in Althusser's text, to such an extent that this could be considered an unresolvable issue. Certainly, by explicitly making the category of subject the central category of the omni-historical functioning of ideology, and by linking in the essay this category to the notion of interpellation, Althusser seems to make it a concept independent of its appearance in the context of modern philosophy. I would even say a scientific concept endowed with precisely only historical validity, and therefore valid for all ideologies, whatever their class or regional content. But this seems to stand in stark contrast, of course, to the way in which he characterizes it in many other places, where subject is considered an ideological notion internal to the dominant modern ideology. What position does Montag take with respect to this alternative? His answer is not explicit, because in fact the text does not address the question directly. At several points in the course of his analysis of the ISA essay, Montag refers to ideology in the singular, a circumstance that would appear to situate his discourse on a level of analysis that, strictly speaking, applies to the thesis of the omnihistoricity of ideology, and thus to a concept of the subject that places itself on this level of generality. However, the entire discourse on the production of interiority developed in the pages about the materialist version of interpellation unfolds in reference to modernity, highlighting the way in which within modern philosophy or capitalist modernity, the production of the subject functions as a supplement of origin that is a supplement of servitude. For example, Montag writes, I quote, "We are so endowed with subjectivity, declared free subjects, originators of our acts, especially the acts of submission and consent. The imposition of human servitude through force and fraud is not enough. It must retroactively produce its origins in the will of each and every subject," then adding in parentheses, "in the modern epoch at least," end quote. Here, clearly, the horizon of interpellation is bound to a certain type of ideology. Again, it is linked to a particular historical phase, and in particular to the dominant modern ideology in its various versions and its concept of the subject. And of course, contractarianism here seems to be a privileged reference in these pages. This reading is clearly in line with the reading of Foucault proposed shortly afterwards, where the soul is nothing but an exterior that imprisons the body and is produced materially by disciplinary practices. In this way, by progressively linking techniques of individualization and subjectivity, Montag rewrites the notion of interpellation in a way that resolves, albeit at the price of a series of decisions, many of the ambiguities surrounding these terms, providing a coherent version of interpellation. One may wonder, however, at this point, what the price or the consequences of these decisions is. That is to say, one may wonder whether in this way, by tying interpellation to the regime of modern historicity, both on the side of the individual and on the side of the subject, one is not only forced, as seems inevitable, to abandon the thesis of the eternity of ideology understood as the permanence throughout history of its structure, but also whether one does not risk reproducing in a different form the tendency surely present in Althusser to restrict the theorization of ideology to a theorization of the dominant ideology of modernity, thus making it very difficult to use this theory of interpellation and ideology to think about the constitution of other dominated or oppositional ideologies, i.e. what we might call other regimes of interpellation, and also to think about the conflict and contradictions within ideology or between different ideologies within the apparatuses. Now, although in the book these questions are not confronted at length, it seems to me that the materialist version of interpellation that Montag proposes, whereby interpellation never depends on a pre-existing interiority, but is the external production of this interiority, is nevertheless the one that indicates a promising way to proceed in this direction, a direction that Montag's text does not take, although it does gesture at it. It is in fact here, in the wake of this resolutely anti-humanist version of interpellation, that from my point of view, his reading can open up, and for me, it did open up, an unprecedented perspective, which is condensed in 2 pages that I wished, when I read the book, were many more. I refer to his observations on the question of functionalism, and his indication that in On Reproduction, Althusser, I quote, furnished the means to theorize revolt and resistance without recourse to a philosophy of consciousness, end quote. The question that Montag poses here is that of revolt and resistance, resistance, not so much to ideology in general, since ideology has no exterior if we follow Althusser, but that of resistance and revolt within ideology and the ideological state apparatuses without resorting to a point external to them, that is, in the transcendence of consciousness, but rather thinking of its possibility from within the materiality of practices and rituals in a rigorously anti-humanist manner. I am thinking here especially of the passages in On Reproduction in which Althusser speaks of primary and secondary ideologies, or of the multiple interpellations that constitute the subject as itself a field of conflict. I think this is a very interesting and important field of investigation, both theoretically and politically, which cannot but be confronted by means of Montag's idea of interpellation as an exterior production of interiority, so as to attempt to produce a non-humanist theory of precisely resistance and revolt. As far as I am concerned, it was undoubtedly the continuous confrontation with Montag's powerful and rigorous reading that allowed me to try and develop this aspect and, in general, the reading I try to carry out of Althusser's theory of ideology. Thank you.